It's now my pleasure to introduce Michael. Many of you may know him already. He was editor of the Far East Economic Review when that great magazine was still in existence. And his new book is called Blood and Silk, and he's going to talk about Southeast Asia. He's actually lived in this part of the world for, 35 years, I think. I know that he speaks Thai, and I know that he speaks Bahasa. He probably speaks other languages as well. He's extremely experienced. He's now working for a conflict resolution organization. So he has lots of hush-hush negotiations between various warring parties across the region. So there's no one better to, I think, to understand this region, whether we're talking about Indonesia or Myanmar or Thailand or Cambodia. So Michael's going to say a few words, then I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you for any of your questions. And his book is, I think, on sale outside, and he will, of course, be prepared to sign copies afterwards. You're not rushing off anywhere, are you, Michael? Yes. So that will be available after we finish at around 2 o'clock. So, Michael, please.
Thank you very much, Victor. Victor and I go back a very long way to the 90s in Bangkok, where we covered some of the Southeast Asian countries. And so it's very good to be here, both with Victor and to be back in the club. Thank you. I want to just say a very few words about the book itself, because I think, as Victor says, it would be great to engage in a discussion. Victor has the advantage of having read the book. At least I hope he read the book. He did review it, but that's not always the case. So therefore, I want to keep my remarks fairly brief. I just want to describe the book itself, which is an ambitious undertaking, which is to try and condense an understanding of power and conflict in Southeast Asia into a book for 10 countries in the region that are incredibly diverse and different, and have not just different histories, but also different contemporary trajectories. However, I have managed to distill some common themes. The book is divided into themes, which I argue are sort of relevant to understanding the dynamics of power, the historical development of society, the role of monarchy, for example. And I also trace the modern political development of the region from the so-called third wave of democratization that swept the world in the 1970s and which hit Southeast Asia with full force in the 1980s. A major part of my argument at the beginning of the book on political development is how minimal the impact of decades of reform and democratization has ultimately been on the political landscape, which is still very much dominated by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian systems, in other words, only partly free. This is where, if we look at what's going on today in Southeast Asia, unfortunately, my book could be considered to be rather timely. Across Southeast Asia today, democracy is very much in peril. We see Myanmar's democratic transition is faltering. Thailand is enduring a 4th year of military rule. Cambodia has just launched an aggressive campaign against the opposition, and Hun Sen, the Prime Minister, has threatened to wage war against the opposition if they win. Malaysia's angry electorate is unlikely to see the ability to vote the government out of office in elections that are likely to take place at the end of this year. In the Philippines, the number of people who have been killed extrajudicially in the last year since President Rodrigo Duterte was elected now exceeds the number of people killed during the Marcos era of martial law. That's more than 10,000 people. Even in Indonesia, where democracy seems secure, there are indications that popular demand for the equality and security are now starting to outweigh respect for one man, one vote. I argue that there are several factors responsible for what I call this democracy deficit. One is an arcane culture of power that sustains a privileged elite and stacks the odd against effective popular sovereignty. 2, enduring impunity and a lack of accountability that sustains high level of stress and conflict in society. Thirdly, unresolved violent conflict, usually at the margins, that poses challenges for representatives of civilian government and hardens and increases the role of the security forces. And then finally, chronic levels of corruption that make elites very defensive and prevents the smooth or regular transfer of power. And then add to this alarmingly high levels of economic inequality, which is further dividing societies, and more recently, and perhaps most importantly, the pressure on ethnic and religious tolerance and pluralism stemming from the rise of identity politics fueled by global trends towards religious orthodoxy and extremism. I can later on give some concrete examples of this, but I also want to mention one or two other themes, one of the other themes that is covered in this book, and that is some of the external geopolitical trends that are buffeting Southeast Asia. The first, with relation to the strain on pluralism, is of course the enduring sectarian struggle between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shiite Iran that first transmitted rebellious impulses across the world in the wake of the 1979 Iran Revolution, which then set up a reactionary Sunni counter-reaction that dispersed the seeds of deeply conservative Salafi Wahhabi Islam into Southeast Asia, creating a fertile environment for Islamic extremism. This, in turn, has fueled rising levels of religious conflict in the region. The second is, of course, the rise of China, the fallout from increasing competition for strategic primacy in Asia, which threatens to end more than half a century of interstate peace and harmony in Southeast Asia. Rising tensions in the South China Sea over China's claims of sovereignty have divided ASEAN, whilst US warships conducting freedom of navigation operations increase the risk of incidents that could spark a war. And China is increasingly asking its neighbors in Southeast Asia to reject alignment with the West as it draws the region into its economic orbit. Very briefly, towards the end of the book, I consider the future of Southeast Asia. And despite the gloomy perspectives that I've elaborated above, I'm reasonably confident that the region will continue to prosper and that people will achieve significant levels of wealth and security, but there will be costs. First, there will be a deepening democracy deficit. Thailand is set to endure a bridled democratic landscape for the next 2 decades. In the Philippines, Duterte's plan for federation, if it passes, will empower his family and clique together with their own violent brand of strongman rule. In Cambodia, Cambodia looks set to abolish multi-party electoral democracy entirely. And in Myanmar, the army could step back into full power. Sectarian and ethnic strife is likely to intensify as political actors increasingly exploit the divisive effect of race and religion, to shore up their power. And this in turn makes for less and more insecure social stability and a heavy security infringement on freedoms. People will accept trade-offs between their security and democratic space. But at the same time, there's probably going to be an uptick in demands for regional autonomy, for irredentism of one kind or another, that could see the dilution of sovereignty and the establishment of more autonomous areas. China, of course, will dominate the geopolitical domain. There will be less tolerance of the region's traditional balancing of the powers between economic and financial autonomy, and the threat of China's particular form of extraterritoriality with regard to the overseas Chinese. On a more sort of upbeat note, fortunately, both access to technology and I think a sufficient degree of what I call demi-democracy will enable civil society to address to a degree the need for some kind of capacity to represent people and push back on the state. This is what I call democracy you can eat. It bypasses the political parties that have failed to deliver to communities at the grassroots, and it ignores increasingly onerous security restrictions and asserts, despite all the odds, popular will. In conclusion, in the next 30 years, I think Southeast Asia may well start to look like the region looked before it was colonized by the European powers, a collection of smaller confederated states with considerably looser affiliations with centralized metropolitan centers. In any case, many of these, with the current state of climate change, may well be underwater. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, have a seat, Michael. And I think one of the questions that a lot of people have is why you are so pessimistic. I mean, in the book you said, there's a line I quoted in my review in the FT, you said, "I notice a distinct contrast between Pollyanna-ish Westerners all agog over the glitz and growth in the region, predicting its glorious future, and anxious Southeast Asians, rich and poor, who harbour worries of lurking catastrophe." I mean, lurking catastrophe, that's quite a strong phrase, and indeed you back it up with a lot of specific predictions about what's going to happen in Malaysia, the breakdown of the multiracial compact in Malaysia, problems in Indonesia, Cambodia, you've talked about, and so on. So I guess my question is, why are you so pessimistic when the economies are mostly still growing pretty fast? Even the laggards that we saw in the past, such as Myanmar and Laos, are starting to catch up economically. I mean, is it just that journalists always savor bad news, or do you really think there are sort of profound reasons to be broadly pessimistic?
Well, I mean, on the economic point, I mean, one of the greatest examples of this is Cambodia, which is actually the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia. It's growing at over 7%. And if you just looked at sort of GDP growth and the fact that actually a lot of this growth is benefiting workers. I mean, there are huge numbers of textile workers in Cambodia that are being pulled, or workers in Cambodia being pulled out of poverty by this, incredible growth in the export market. It's sort of a bit like Southeast Asia 20 years ago in Cambodia. Huge levels of investment in manufacturing. It's a little bit behind the curve, but it's benefiting from this frothy sort of economic growth. And yet you have a prime minister who does not believe that anyone has the right to turf him out of power. You have a multi-party electoral democracy that was put in place after the country was saved, from civil war and the dreadful predations of the Khmer Rouge in the mid-1970s, late 1970s. It was put together again, and with all the help of the international and, importantly, the regional community. And yet, sort of 30 years on, he's been in power ever since. And he's decided that the election, if the opposition wins the election, he'll go to war. Now, so what is the point of having all that economic growth and stability if the ruler of the country has decided he wants to rule forever? And it begins to undermine stability in society. And if you talk to young Cambodians, because of that economic growth, they've acquired levels of education and understanding of the world through social media that makes them want to have a choice. And so that sets up an inevitable conflict. That's my point.
Thank you. Yeah, you sort of partly answered the question. I was going to play the devil's advocate and say, so what's not to like? I mean, the authoritarian argument, the Chinese argument, if you like, is that there's nothing wrong with authoritarian governments because they deliver prosperity. But you're making the traditional Western liberal argument, if you like, which is that ultimately that clash becomes, the clash of educated people who've taken advantage of that prosperity to become more aware of the world around them. We're going to now face that clash, and therefore doom is around the corner.
I think we have to be careful about saying it's a Western liberal argument. I mean, I was an observer in the Myanmar election in 2015, and then when you talk to people on the street in Cambodia, the young kids, they simply say it's not about values. It's about the fact that we know now that we have a better understanding of the world that we might be better off if we have choice, and we might be better off if there's a change. In 2015 in Myanmar, it was often said that people were voting for Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. A lot of people were simply voting for the opportunity to change the government, because change was seen as something that inevitably, it may not resolve all our problems, but it might be slightly better for us than we have, the situation we have now. And I don't think that's necessarily a Western liberal understanding of classical democracy. It's a sort of natural impulse in society that, well, if there's change, it might be better.
Fair enough. Now, China, you talked about China, and I want you to go into that in a bit more detail, because I think this audience in particular would be interested about the influence that China is having, and the way that the countries in Southeast Asia react to it. I mean, Cambodia, that you just mentioned, is heavily sort of in hock to China. China's providing all kinds of aid, including, I think, military aid, and certainly supporting Hun Sen, as they did to the Khmer Rouge when he was the Khmer Rouge commander. But the question is how does that Chinese influence and attempt to dominate Southeast Asia, how does that manifest itself around the region? And which countries, if any, are trying to push back, or even able to push back? I mean, and I suppose the ones that spring to mind would be Vietnam, and possibly Singapore.
Yeah, this is in many ways one of the great sort of foci of debate in Southeast Asia currently, because on the one hand, the old comfortable assumption that Southeast Asia, using its traditional means of balancing the great powers, in history it was sort of, balancing the colonial powers, playing one off against the other. Before that, ensuring that there was a sort of judicious mix of Hindu, Buddhist influence. And in more recent years, of course, in the wake of the Cold War, it has been the sort of comfortable assumption that the US and the West more generally will help sort of set up a counterbalance to the inevitable rise of China. Well, a couple of things have put paid to that. One, of course, as everyone knows, is that President Obama's attempt to assert a pivot didn't quite work. And of course, the Trump administration has thrown that pivot into doubt. And as a result of the rise of Xi Jinping and his own particular brand of global diplomacy, the old idea of China's peaceful rise has transformed into a sort of much more assertive rise of China, which very much impinges on Southeast Asia, particularly, and it's seen very often through the lens of the claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea. Although I'd argue that that's a little bit of an anomaly. What's more important is China's relentless growth of infrastructure, development of infrastructure, taking over sort of corporate and other aspects of business in Southeast Asia, using the means of business, but also a politically directed strategy. And so this is, of course, a great concern. And because the means of balancing it no longer exists, I think it's created a lot of division in Southeast Asia. Cambodia has decided, as in the words of one foreign ministry official to me in Phnom Penh last year, it's lips and teeth. I mean, they're simply never going to object or put up any resistance to any of China's policy requests. This has an enormous impact on the governing of the Mekong region, where Cambodia will simply comply with everything that China asks for. And similarly, there's a growth of military-to-military cooperation in Cambodia. China is increasingly putting in sort of sophisticated listening equipment in Cambodia. So the old way in which the US used these alliances in Southeast Asia to put military assets and a military capability on the ground is now happening with the Chinese in Cambodia. One looks, one hears and reads stories about the selling of equipment. I don't think that's so important. I mean, it's more about what China will actually do in terms of, a developing of a relationship that will enable them to gain some sort of access to the means of security and to the economy. And then the third element is, of course, there's the movement of people. I mean, Thailand had 12 million Chinese tourists last year. There are many more expected to come this year. I was in a meeting the other day with a Chinese official and Thai officials, where the Chinese official pointedly pointed out that, to the Thai official that, your economy begins to depend more and more on the fact that we send these 12 million tourists to your country. And so there is that sort of what the Chinese would delightfully call people-to-people contact, which also has an incredible economic ramification. And then finally, there is the great fear in Southeast Asia that even if things go pear-shaped in China, economically speaking, there is this great fear of immigration from China, that if things really begin to go downhill, Chinese will simply, as they did in the 19th century and the early 20th century, simply pick up and come to the region in large numbers. So there is increasingly a sort of concern about immigration as well.
And is there a backlash, even against tourists? We had, I guess in the 60s and 70s, we had the so-called ugly American, the idea of America stomping all over Asia. And then, in fact, when we were in Bangkok, there was a book published called The Ugly Japanese. And this was really talking about Japanese dominance of Southeast Asian business and so on. And are we now in the era of the ugly Chinese, in the sense that that China is possibly resented by tourists are resented for being uncouth or whatever it may be, and businesses are resented for being over-dominant? What sort of feeling do you get in the various Southeast Asian countries that you visit
Yeah, it's
is there a kind of popular feeling of, oh, we've had enough of these guys? Or?
Yeah, it's very similar to the way that loud American tourists were sort of considered in Europe in the 1970s. Plaid jackets and nylon pants. In the case of the Chinese, there is this sort of the image of the ugly Chinese tourist. I mean, Thailand, where I spend a lot of my time, the Chinese are also considered very mean as tourists. They don't spend a lot. A lot of the tourism is organized by Chinese companies. The revenue goes to Chinese companies. They'll sort of sweep through a hotel lobby without actually using the F&B, but bringing in their own food. There is that kind of sense that they're cheapskates, that they're a little bit too loud. Although I have to say, increasingly, my encounters with Chinese tourists in Southeast Asia is that, again, they're a bit like sort of Westerners and Europeans. They want to explore, they're interested, they don't know the language, they don't know their way around. There's a lot more, I think, independent travel now coming out of China with young people who are basically just trying to move around the region. And so it'll go through these phases. But yes, you're right, there is that image.
Great. I'm going to open it out to the floor in a second. I just got one last question, which I think, again, is sort of an interest to us at the club, and that is, how do you see, and you're, as a former journalist, you'll be interested in this, how do you see press freedom in Southeast Asia? And, my rather depressed view of it is that it's just been getting worse year by year, and that the last countries where it was possible to operate freely and independently as a journalist are becoming fewer and fewer. And obviously we all used to be based in Thailand, and that's becoming more difficult. Is there anywhere now in Southeast Asia where journalists can operate and the free media can operate and people can publish any books or newspapers they want or websites, or is that becoming more difficult?
The short answer is Indonesia, because Indonesia still has a vibrant free press. Most of the media is still independently owned. And the trouble of Indonesia is that it's not an English language press. And so while there is this incredibly vibrant media, it's not so accessible to the rest of the region. And as you know, the problem in the region is that there is no facility to circulate each other's countries' media in the countries. So you can buy the FT, you can buy the New York Times, but you can't really buy the Straits Times or even a newspaper from here like the SMP. And the different publications don't really circulate in each other's countries. I think the bigger problem, though, now is that the consumer of media is interested now in what is true and what is not true. It's not so much about the freedom. There is this great concern now that political actors are manipulating social media to such a degree. Indonesia is a case in point. There is this whole fear of what they call the cyber armies, where politicians will hire at little cost 300-400 people to sort of manipulate social media. And so what people are looking for is media that can be assuredly true. I mean, there is a great concern about fake news, and that, there was I think we all face the danger of that. There was a posting in Indonesian media just yesterday with Aung San Suu Kyi telling Indonesians to shut up, stop talking about Rakhine, shut your mouth.
But it wasn't true.
Well, I mean, it was palpably free media, but where does that come, fake news, but where does that come from? Who's pumping it out? So there are fears that politicians are doing this, and also increasingly, going back to the identity politics issue in Malaysia and Indonesia, it's hardline, Islamic extremists will be throwing stories out that they want people to believe. And so I think there is, obviously, in Thailand, the Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, great concerns for traditional media freedoms, but even in those countries where you have media freedom, there's great concern about veracity.
Thanks. I think the Philippine Daily Inquirer is being bought by a friend of Duterte's, isn't it, right now, which is the sort of main independent newspaper. Right, so can we get the microphone, this gentleman first, then somebody over there, and then back here, yeah.
David,
just say who you are, thanks, and then ask your question.
David Tweed from Bloomberg. I'm just curious, you were just talking about the freedom of the press. You mentioned that one of your themes in the book is the role of monarchies in Southeast Asia. We know, we certainly hear very much about the Thai monarchy and the freedom of the press issues surrounding that. But what are the other themes that you've explored about how the monarchies fit into this whole dynamic?
Well, for me, I wrote a book in the mid-1990s about political culture in Southeast Asia, where I sort of first picked up on this theme that there was this wonderful period at the end of the colonial era of modernism, where nations in Southeast Asia were established as modern nations. Indonesia being a case in point, it was established as a republic and a democracy. What I started to see in the early 1990s was that some of the modern leaders, and particularly the sort of more authoritarian ones, were kind of recovering the old traditions of kingship and sort of absolute power, where there's a relationship between the ruler and the ruled, which is based on obligation and patronage. I mean, Singapore is a particularly good example where, Lee Kuan Yew made very many statements about the obligation between the ruler and the ruled, even though he'd started off as a socialist. Mahathir Mohamad was, I think, the best example of a man who, he never really grew up in the sort of colonial elite milieu. He didn't benefit from a sort of an Oxford or Cambridge education. In many ways, he kind of resented that he didn't have one. And as a result, his father had been, for instance, a member of the Axis movement led by Subhash Chandra Bose. So he was kind of anti-West in such a way that it sort of started to govern his notions of leadership. And so the modern period gave, as I call it, at the end of the colonial period, gave way to a postmodern period where people started to recover these traditions. Suharto was another very good example in Indonesia. And controversially, perhaps, in the book, I compare Suharto with King Bhumibol as people who consider themselves ideal rulers in the traditional sense, in the sort of Hindu-Buddhist sense. Now, to some extent, it made for very efficient leadership, especially at a time when democracy was imperfect and people did expect to be, and I think still do expect to be led in many of these countries. There's this overemphasis on personal leadership. And so, yes, it's a very important theme in the book, and it's one that I think it got in the mid-1990s. It was, and I think Victor can speak to this as well, because he wrote a book about this time, which looked at some of these issues. There was this great debate about whether or not that's the Asian values are ones that there's a sort of true and impactful aspect of that, or whether this was just going to be swept away by a wave of democratization. I would argue that it hasn't. One of the problems we face with interpreting Aung San Suu Kyi today is whether or not she's trying to appease the army to stay in power, or whether she actually really does believe that she's become the ruler of Myanmar.
Thanks. Yeah, no, we are sort of in a way back to that old sort of Confucian debate where China and other authoritarians will quote Confucius as saying you must respect your rulers, but they forget the bits of Confucius where he says you should challenge or indeed overthrow your rulers if they're not doing the right thing. So it's sort of, there's a lot of selective Confucianism out there. There's a question
Thank
over
you.
there.
Yes. I'm Joel Lakin. I'm posing the question from the IPPF, the Independent Power Producers Forum. Let's go back to China for a second. Could you comment a bit on all this stuff about OBAR or BRI, otherwise known as One Belt, One Road, the impact, the benefits, or lack of them, or whatever, how it impacts on Southeast Asia, OBAR?
Thank you. Yeah, which is now, I think, because of the OBOR issue, is now called BRI. Which sounds like a sort of state bank in Indonesia. State bank in Indonesia. So there was a very interesting speech made by, and I think the best way to look at this is through the lens of Singapore, because Singapore is the one country that tried initially to resist the whole notion of OBOR or BRI, believing firmly that there was going to be this wonderful new Trans-Pacific partnership produced by the United States and sort of a lot of other countries in the region to sort of shore up, Western trade, which has now completely fallen apart. And so there was initially quite a bit of dissing of the whole BRI issue, but now Singapore's had to turn completely around because in this speech made last week by the Home Minister, the former Foreign Minister Shanmugam, there's an attempt now to sort of to justify the wonderful sort of opportunities of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. And so in many ways it's become a bit of a football and a sort of the initiative itself has become a symbol of China's strategic ambitions in the region, and very few people have actually looked at its potential significance in terms of whether it really will light up the old Silk Road, restore the sort of the old glorious prosperity of that sort of historical memory, and all the way to Europe. I think there's the deep suspicion in Southeast Asia that the chief beneficiaries of BRI are more likely to be further away, Central Asia and beyond, rather than Southeast Asia. And if you look at the map of the BRI, the Belt and Road, some parts of it almost sort of go around Southeast Asia. And so there's a real concern that they may not actually be beneficiaries. But I would say for the time being, unfortunately or fortunately, it's mainly seen as a metaphor for China's strategic ambitions.
Yeah, it's worth looking at the record in South Asia as well, where Pakistan, which because of its partial break with the US might be expected to welcome it, you're beginning to see mutterings of discontent in Pakistan where they're saying, well, these power stations are great, but they're overcharging for these power stations, and we're going to have to pay the debt down that is being raised to pay for these things. So obviously the roads are good, but there are downsides as well, especially if you're paying for the BRI yourself. There's a gentleman here first, and then sorry, you've got the mic. Okay, so you go first, then pass it to him, and then someone here. Yeah.
Jürgen Kracht, thank you very much. Just one comment, one question. What you just said about Singapore, I don't know if you're aware that actually Singapore was not invited to the Belt and Road Summit in Beijing in June, which I think is a clear sign of what's happening politically. My question comes back to the matter of influence, and again, Belt and Road. My understanding is that, for example, the railway in Thailand will be owned, the land will be owned by Chinese state-owned companies. The actual land where the railway is built and the land around it. Isn't that a new type of colony policy?
I was just thinking of exactly that point when Victor was mentioning the concerns about the infrastructure projects. I mean, Thailand has started to have arguments with the Chinese about the building of the railroads because they want to extend the land either side of the railway far more than would necessarily be needed for a railway. And just as importantly, China is starting to build a number of industrial estates in the north of the country where they're acquiring huge tracts of land and essentially sort of putting in small Chinese towns filled with Chinese workers, and people are beginning to sort of wonder, well, what's going on here, and so yes, I mean there is a sense in which, at least in the northern part of mainland Southeast Asia, there's a kind of a seeping down, not just of infrastructure projects, but everything that comes with it, including Chinese settlement.
Thanks. Yes.
Hello. Hello, I'm Tohan Shi, a Singaporean. I want to ask you a few interrelated questions. Given the very public dispute among the children of Lee Kuan Yew, how deep and how real is the internal divisions within the ruling People's Action Party? And there are all these rumors that former Singapore Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong is secretly colluding with the Workers' Party opposition leader Low Thia Khiang to form a faction against Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. How true are those rumors? And the third question is, since you're working in conflict resolution, are you secretly helping to resolve the conflict among the Lee siblings?
I think your point about Goh Chok Tong is a very good one, because I've always felt that Goh Chok Tong was the most popular leader by far that Singapore had ever had. And so perhaps that rumor stems from the sense that people have that he was genuinely a ruler from the people. He was genuinely very popular. I know many of the people who worked for him are still very fiercely loyal to Goh Chok Tong. And he's often played a role in recent years as a kind of intermediary when there are difficult issues. But as to your factual question, or, I mean, no one, the PAP is more, there's more transparency in the Vatican than there is in the PAP. It's very, very hard to. But I will say one thing that surprised me. I actually wasn't in Singapore when this whole dispute broke out, and there were two things that struck me. One is the whole thing played out on Facebook, because the media is still very bridled, but Facebook no controls, and so the family simply dumped everything onto Facebook, so that all the newspapers were forced to quote Facebook postings. And what was surprising, of course, is Facebook was completely uncontrolled. And the whole thing just played out. Secondly, no one in that whole debate in Parliament, not one person, not from the opposition, not from any side, exploited this in any way. There was no sense in which someone said, no, actually, is this such a good thing that you're being, that you're being attacked by your own family and maybe there's some way of dealing with it? Everyone was just completely silent. And then, thirdly, it leads you on to assume that even if for now there's no impact of that, then maybe later on there will be an impact, because clearly it has dented, people's faith in, which so far had been undented, in the Lee family. So I think it's clearly down the road perhaps created some opportunities, some issues, but who's to know? I was talking to someone from the Straits Times the other day who complained that the government still would call up the Straits Times and prevent them from reporting things that are freely available on Facebook. So on the one hand, social media has blown a lot of things very open, but the media is still controlled. And I think the bigger issue in Singapore is the whole debate over Singapore's exposure to the rising China, and I think that's the number one political issue really, is how does Singapore handle its relationship with China? And we've seen that debated quite openly in the divisions between different factions of the foreign ministry and so on, more so than in the political sphere.
Yeah, it was a curious moment. I mean, because of Facebook, as you said, and because the government responded. I mean, the Prime Minister responded on Facebook. A lot of people have forgotten that. So it wasn't just one side on Facebook. And so for the first time, the media, which have been completely muzzled on this issue, including the international media to a large extent, by the threat of $1 million fines for using the word dynasty and nepotism, were able essentially to report on a family dispute that everybody knew about, but nobody had been able to mention before, or at least on a dynastic phenomenon that no one had been able to mention freely. So it was kind of, in a curious way, it was a moment of press freedom in Singapore, which was quite unexpected. Yes, gentleman, lady here, sorry, yes.
Over the last week or two...
Edith, right?
Edith Terry, sorry. Over the last week or two, with the sort of huge increase of refugees and violence in Rakhine State, there have been increasing international calls for Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Peace Prize to be withdrawn. I wonder what your perspective is on that debate. Is her silence a culpable silence? How do you view it?
The short answer is that honestly no one really knows. She has become a very inscrutable individual personality. I was in a room with her the other day in Naypyidaw at a very public forum, and I was watching how when she walks into the room, she doesn't really look at anyone. She sort of walks in a bubble and avoids eye contact and has a very sort of regal demeanor. And so I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, not even Fergal Keane these days necessarily gets the, the essence of what she's thinking. And I was watching her, even the posting that was widely circulated after her conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey. She was using the term "we," at least in quotes. There was "we know very well, what it means to be deprived of human rights." And I thought, well, who are we talking about there?
The royal we, presumably. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, but then a lot of what she says is not what she has said. It's put together by a close circle of officials. What's very interesting, though, Edith, is that we do know that the close circle of officials that she has surrounded herself with happen to be drawn from a pool of foreign ministry officials who, during the Slork period, were extremely, and I know that Andy Hain is in the room today, so he was ambassador in Burma. He may or may not disagree, but people like Jortin Sway, Jortin, came from a group of foreign ministry officials who, I think it's fair to say, really suffered under the Slork period, the full onslaught of Western criticism, the sort of whole sanctions debate, and so on. And they're now in very key positions of responsibility around Aung San Suu Kyi in her state councillor's office. And they're the ones who control the message. And they're extremely conservative, and I think it's fair to say somewhat hostile towards the international community.
Thanks. We've probably got time for two more. Yes.
Hi, we do, Channel News Asia. Nowadays, if you read, you follow the domestic media in a region, there's a lot of coverage of terrorism, ISIS, and whenever people can throw in the word ISIS, so they would. One would understand that's probably more real terrorism threat in Philippines and Indonesia, but for the other countries, what's your feeling? How much of a threat is real? How much of it is really the government needing a bad guy out there?
You mean generally in the region, or? Well, I have a bit of a beef with some of the analysis that's done based on tracking down networks of extremists, because I think there's obviously a great potential for people to return from the battlefield in Syria, and we've seen in the southern Philippines how easy it is for people, whether they're ideologically, doctrinally motivated or not, to latch on to the sort of IS branding as a tool of recruitment, as a tool to build their following, which I think has been the case in Marawi, which is still not over. There are still about 40 or 50 militants in the city holding out in a couple of mosques after 3 months. And if you've seen the pictures of Marawi and you compare them side by side with the pictures of Mosul, it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference. Having said that, I spoke earlier about the general context of concern that I have about rising identity politics, and for me that's the bigger danger. It's the accretion of wave upon wave of conservative orthodoxy that's imposed on society, on Muslim society, that traditionally has never really had that kind of exclusive identity. And that's what's really changed in society. And that's what forms, if you like, the petri dish in which a lot of these extremists can sort of then develop. But they're still very much marginal groups of people. They don't represent the mainstream. What worries me more in terms of mainstream are the 500,000 people that were on the streets of Jakarta in December, demanding that the Christian Chinese governor be jailed. And in fact, he was. He was jailed for blasphemy for 2 years. Because once you have that sort of harnessing mass social protest that has an impact on elected political officials, that's in a way more dangerous to me than the threat of a few marginal individuals who might throw a bomb and blow up a hotel, which of course we all see as a greater threat. But for me, the more existential threat is the change in society that's being brought about.
Yes, sorry, right over there. Can only just see. Yeah.
Right in the corner. Hi.
Yeah.
I'm Eliza. I'm just gone back to university to study psychology. So maybe a naive question. I was just wondering, why is this worldwide lurch to the right happening, and what's going to come of it, in your opinion?
And maybe that's a good point to talk about inequality, which you do talk about, and that's a sort of worldwide phenomenon as well, isn't it? And it's one of the reasons why we've seen Brexit, and one of the reasons we've seen Trump. I don't know if that's part of the worldwide lurch you're talking about.
Well, I would just say I wish we'd all studied psychology more. We might understand a bit more. I mean, speaking of from those of us who try to report on phenomenon. And I think the case in Southeast Asia, to be more sort of accurate, is that obviously overall rates of poverty have been going down over the years, but overall rates of inequality have been going up. And as Victor alluded, I mean, this is part of a global phenomenon. But what's specific in Southeast Asia, which I would add to, is maybe that's also the case in the US, but it's the particular contribution of selfish ruling elites to this problem, which is knowing that there's inequality, knowing that there is sort of relatively poor access to services, and education. They still want to impose their own rent-seeking subsidies, or rent-seeking tariffs. The World Bank produced a very alarming report on food security in Indonesia that showed that the cost of staple foods in Indonesia is actually higher than in Singapore. in some areas and in some cases. And that's simply because people are people in the import tariffs that are put on imported food are being raked off by the sort of the elite. And in many cases where you have the existence of services that are supposed to serve lower income areas, lower income parts of the population, they simply don't have the services exist, but they don't have the means by which to deliver those services. It's shocking that 20 or 30%, maybe 30% of government-run clinics in and around Jakarta don't stock sufficient drugs. And so it's not just income inequality, it's also the perceived inequality of access to services. So if you're rich, if you're a member of the elite, you can go to a private hospital, you can go to Singapore for treatment. But if you're basically on the outskirts of a city like Jakarta, you can't get basic drugs. That's what's driving a lot of insecurity, human insecurity. So I think it's more than just income inequality. It's inequality of access to services. And it's shocking, frankly, in Indonesia that 20% of the budget is spent on education, and yet they cannot provide basic, quality education to people who now increasingly know what that means.
But is it the rulers who are right-wing, or are their actions and the inequality giving rise to sort of right-wing populist opposition?
The latter.
Thank you. I think that's all we've got time for, unless anyone has a very pressing question they want to ask me. No. Okay, last one, just here. Yeah.
Michael, great to see you, and I've known you since 1989 in Jakarta. The elephant in the living room, can you talk about North Korea for a second?
I wrote a book about Southeast Asia.
I'm sure we'll have a panel soon.
We could start one now. But no, I mean, actually, Southeast Asia remains remarkably uninterested in North Korea, despite the fears that everyone seems to have. And yet, I would say this. I mean, actually, if the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians were being a little bit more imaginative, they actually might use some of the back channels that Southeast Asian countries have. I mean, it was well reported by Reuters that Malaysian companies linked to the ruling party were selling battlefield radios to the North Korean army until very recently. Former President Megawati of Indonesia has a personal relationship, with the North Koreans. And I've been struck by the fact that, the U.S. administration has had this sort of constant refrain about China must do more. China must do more. Well, in fact, there are many other countries that could help too.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I was struck in London by how, everyone in London's very exercised about North Korea, and you come back to Asia and people are, yeah, it'll be fine, which I don't know who's right, but it's definitely true. Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed. If you get a chance to buy it, it's a great book. And we hope to see you again soon. So Michael will be here for a few minutes if you need to talk to him.
There are some books for sale over there.
Books for sale, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michael.